Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Secrets and Spies. On today's episode, I'm speaking once again with Phillip Smyth, previously a Sora Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy from 2018 to 2021. Phillip is one of the leading researchers studying Iranian-backed militia groups in the Middle East. He returns to the podcast today to unpack the January 28th drone attack against a U.S. military outpost in Jordan that killed 3 service members and the resulting round of airstrikes beginning on February 2nd, targeting the militias believed to have been responsible. Phillip gives his take on the degree of Iranian control over these militias, analyzes the effectiveness of the U.S. response thus far, and tells us what, if anything, can be done to deter future attacks. As always, a couple of housekeeping notes first. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast streaming app of choice. And if you're not already, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Super easy. Just go to patreon.com/Secrets and Spies. Your generosity helps keep this podcast going. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Phillip Smyth, thanks for coming back on the pod on such short notice, buddy. It's, as always, good to have you. Wish it could be under better circumstances, but that's the business we're in.
Nature of the beast.
Yeah, really. So I asked you to come back on today to unpack the attack on our service members in Jordan and discuss some of the follow-on retaliation that the U.S. Air Force executed so we're recording this on Monday. The first round of airstrikes as of this recording was on Friday, and we're going to talk about that all in a bit. Before we get going, though, for anyone who might have missed the first couple episodes since October that you've been on, tell us a bit about you and your work.
Okay. Well, my name's Phillip Smyth. You can follow a lot of my work. I put a lot of it up on Twitter, but if you Google my name, it's 2 L's, Smyth. I follow Iranian-backed organizations. I mean, you may hear the term proxy thrown around, or Iranian-backed militias, like Shia militias. There are other groups that are not Shia. Sometimes they have different ideological beliefs from what the Iranians promote. But in general, it's this wide network of proxy organizations that Iran sponsors and pushes. And I tend to follow those guys. And I've been doing that for over 15 years now. I did a lot of early work when it was not really an issue that many people cared about. And just kind of kept doing it since then. I've worked at a number of major think tanks in Washington, D.C. I've lived in the Middle East, and I regularly engage engage a lot of Shia militia members, commanders, follow a lot of their activities. And it's been a very, very long process and kind of a long kind of, let's call it like an institutional kind of growth that I've tried to promote for following a lot of these groups. So that's essentially what I do, the long and short of it.
Thank you for that. And as I've said on here before, I think you're kind of like the guy for this. So it's, as always, it's good to have you on when something flares up regarding these groups here. So to get us started off here, I'm going to give us a few background notes on the attack itself in Jordan and how we got to this specific round here. So on January 28th, an attack drone launched by a Shia militia struck the living quarters of the U.S. logistical support base Tower 22 in Rukban, northeast Jordan, near the tri-border area with Iraq and Syria. The outpost is part of a network of U.S. bases in the region established in 2015 to support an ongoing advise and assist mission for Kurdish forces combating ISIS remnants in the area. The attack killed 3 U.S. service members who were asleep in their tents at the time, all subsequently identified as belonging to the 718th Engineer Company, a U.S. Army Reserve unit at Fort Moore, Georgia. 47 others were reportedly injured. The Islamic resistance in Iraq, an umbrella term encompassing several Iranian-backed militia groups, claimed responsibility later that day. Since Hamas's October 7th attacks against Israel and the beginning of the Gaza War, Iranian-linked groups struck U.S. and coalition forces throughout the Middle East on 160 occasions, injuring approximately 70 personnel. The U.S. retaliated for these incidents only 8 times previously. So, Philip, before we get into the U.S. response to these attacks, if you can, tell us a bit, any kind of, background on this group calling itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, who they are, and any kind of chatter that you've been monitoring amongst these guys that perhaps preceded the attack itself.
Sure. So I think we need a little bit more context with a lot of this. 'Cause, I mean, it's interesting, how I'm seeing a lot of the reporting coming out. Just kind of this accepted reality. Oh, this Islamic resistance, and they're connected with a bunch of militias. Okay, what does that mean? Since 2020, and this is when the United States killed 2 rather prominent leaders in kind of the Iranian proxy machinery, meaning the guys really managing and growing and creating a lot of these proxy networks that the Iranians are using. The first and foremost of them was Qasem Soleimani, who is the leading general for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, I mean, think of that as kind of the central hub for the Iranians when they are projecting and creating, managing, and controlling a lot of the proxy groups or using them. And then his lieutenant, who was an Iraqi, his mother was Iranian, but he was an Iraqi named Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. And he was a prominent leader in what's called al-Hashd al-Shabi, which you might see it in the news in English. It's the Popular Mobilization Forces or Popular Mobilization Units. That's a collective of primarily Shia militias that are Iraqi government sponsored, but they are dominated by Iranian-controlled groups and Iranian-backed groups. So when those 2 were killed, the Iranians had a strategy that came forth in Iraq, which was to create front groups. And these front groups would sometimes execute attacks. They would do different threats against American forces. They wouldn't just attack American forces, but it was also attacking perceived and very real American allies and kind of other partners in the region. That went for the Kurds at times. Sometimes it was allied states, or at least partner states, like the UAE, Kuwait, Saudi. There were threats, and sometimes there were, attacks that they claimed that they had launched. So you had these front groups kind of operating that way. And when I say a front group, imagine I've already established an organization, and then I'm claiming responsibility using another name, kind of like a nom de plume in literature, or a nom de guerre, a name of war that I've just kind of slapped on the top. Now, part of that, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, why would they go through all that trouble if they've already have like a million different militias that are out there and, doing all of that? And I would make the argument that it's a form of kind of implausible, plausible deniability. It gives just enough for a policymaker who doesn't really want to act, like enough kind of leeway, if an American policymaker, enough leeway to go, oh, it's kind of confusing. I guess we don't know what to do here. And I know, who knows? I just want to make it very, very clear, though, that it was quite clear from the beginning which organizations were being used by the Iranian, specific militias, specific Iraqi Shia militias, that were being used to kind of populate this front strategy. So I guess going to kind of the current setup, you mentioned the Islamic resistance in Iraq. The Arabic name is Al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya fil Iraq. To clarify something else, I mean, you're going to love this, with a million different names and a lot of repeating names and a lot of stuff like this. Like you have to be permanently on, and also kind of operating in a lot of binary code to really get it all down. But the Islamic resistance in Iraq is actually quite a common name that's used, that's attached to quite a few organizations that the Iranians use, not just in Iraq. I mean, using the term Islamic resistance. I mean, Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, is called Al-Muqawama Al-Islamiyya fi Lebanon. And it's the Islamic resistance in Lebanon. They use this every other time. I mean, they've even tried to describe, the Houthis, known as Ansar Allah, as, the Islamic resistance in Yemen. They slap this onto pretty much everything. So, if you wanted to pick a front group and calling it, oh, it's the Islamic resistance in Iraq. Okay, which one?
Right.
What do you mean? The broader overview kind of structure of all these different militias that they've used before, or do you mean something new? Do you mean something here? Do you mean something there? But in this case, using this kind of this term, it specifically refers to, even though they didn't really completely openly say it, but this is really how it's operating. This Islamic resistance in Iraq, this front group, this specific front group, is populated by two major parties, and there's one other side party that's kind of in there that also is quite a prominent one, but has not been as open as the other two. And so I'll name all three of these Iraqi Shia militias that are, and when I say they're controlled by Iran, they are controlled by Iran. There is no doubt that the Iranians, through the IRGC, not only have very, very long links to these groups, but that there is a good amount of control, and I can outline that if you'd like,
Yeah.
because it's interesting what was passing around as news from certain shadowy figures in the administration and elsewhere. Well, we just have no idea what the deal is with these groups. No, everybody knew. Like everybody knew. It did not take a specialist like me. They knew. But anyway, first group that's there is a group called Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, or also known as Harakat al-Nujaba. I can actually say, interestingly, two of the groups that are mentioned in here, I wrote the first English profiles on them that are online. Sadly, the profiles, because a lot of the data was lost when the servers were changed, and there was a lot of other stuff going on technically with the website. But I did write about these guys very early on, so it's interesting to see them come back now. But the first one, that Nujaba, actually wrote that profile on them, and I know a lot of their early command structure. I've talked to these guys quite a bit. They were one of the leading recruiters for the Iranians of Iraqi Shia to go to Syria. And they were created in 2013. They were split off of another group called Asayib Ahl al-Haq, actually a former Secretary General of Asayib Ahl al-Haq named Akram Kabi was used by the Iranians to kind of populate and grow this group. But kind of it's in initial stages, it was I would say it was far more disunited than what many people thought. It was kind of being populated and grown by the Iranians with some heavy guidance, to the Iraqis who were on the ground there. So you have that organization, and Akram Kabi himself has taken on quite a prominent role in kind of this front strategy. Now, when I was mentioning the front strategy before, that really kind of started and really started to gain some traction from 2020 to 2021. 2021 in particular was when it really started to get moving. But he had come out and was quite a public face for these front groups. Like, there was no denying that, there was a clear connection that was going back to, at the very least, his organization. So Kabi has been out there and been quite a mouthpiece for a number of different fronts. But with the Islamic resistance in Iraq, this new front group, he has been, again, quite an open person talking about it. In fact, Nujaba, from the beginning, and when I say from the beginning, I mean since October 7th, and since this kind of new wave of attacks using a front group was initiated, Kabi really took an outsized role, talking about kind of what his group was involved with. Like, they were not hiding the fact that they were part of this Islamic resistance in Iraq that was launching attacks. And I mean, that went down to, everything from the propaganda footage they were putting up, the statements that they were releasing. They were very, very, very open about it. So that's just, think of that as kind of, one of a few of the groups. So second group, which is extraordinarily important for this, and extraordinarily important, the Iraqi Shia proxy of the Iranians, to the point where they are pretty directly controlled, is a group called Kataib Hezbollah. So the second group, Kataib Hezbollah, Literally, it's the Hezbollah battalions or Hezbollah brigades. Some people will say you don't want to confuse them with Lebanese Hezbollah. I mean, I would agree. One's an Iraqi group and one's a Lebanese group, but they essentially follow the same ideological precepts. They have the same level of connection and link with the Iranians. Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq is considered a first among equals when it comes to Iran's proxies, just as Lebanese Hezbollah is considered a first among equal amongst the rest of its proxies. So it's a very, very important group. And in fact, Kataib Hezbollah was created by the man I had mentioned earlier, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He had actually taken guys who were even more loyal already out of a loyalist Iraqi Shia militia group called the Badr Brigades at the time, put them into special groups. They were in 5 different networks, and then he combined them all together to create this group, Kataib Hezbollah. And Kataib Hezbollah, right now, one of their commanders, named Abu Fadak al-Muhammad Ali, he is actually the operations head. He's like the big cheese guy who controls al-Hashd al-Shabi. Interesting how you're placing all these guys from these little nodes in all these important positions who control different things. So Kataib Hezbollah has also had a very, very important role in maintaining and being a big part, kind of an operational part and intelligence part to this Islamic resistance in Iraq. So that's part for them. Another group that I would mention, and this is a group that I know in Arabic or English, I wrote the first profile on them, called Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, Masters of the Martyrs Brigade. And that was actually, this is like classic. I mean, I know people are going to listen to this and they're going to get lost with, oh my God, this group is just split into this group and this and this and this. And I think from my writing that, boy, do I love me some splinters. Like I just love hyper complex it is. It's like looking at it like a tourbillon movement in a watch. It just keeps getting more and more complicated, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's really not. So one of those networks, I mentioned that there were 5 networks that were combined and made into Kataib Hezbollah. Well, one of those networks run by 2 prominent commanders, one named Abu Allah al-Wala'i, and then the other one who's known as Abu Mustafa. They kind of had an issue, and I mean, this is how the Arabic press was reporting it. They had an internal issue in Kataib Hezbollah where they were not as favorable with some of the leadership that was there. Some claimed it was because that leadership was a bit too youthful. Other times it was, these guys wanted to be involved in politics and kind of get their take, whereas Kataib Hezbollah wasn't really allowing that at the time. And very early on, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada was allowed to kind of split off around the same time that Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba did. This was in early 2013, late 2012. And it's interesting, both groups were essentially pushed to do a lot of heavy recruitment to get guys over to Syria. This was a way the Iranians used them to not just prove loyalty, but to also prove utility, and to kind of keep those pressure points going within, a larger proxy network. So you have Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada there, and they may have had certain issues internally, but sometimes I think people, especially people in the press and people in policy, this is often an effect of reading the wrong international relations books, will regularly think that, there's an issue there, we can exploit that. No, these guys are IRGC fighters. I mean, they are Iraqis, but they have been alongside running networks that the IRGC has used to attack Americans, to attack others, to kind of build political and military influence. They are never leaving that umbrella, the Iranian umbrella, that is. So these are 3 hyper extreme organizations that are involved in this. And again, what they do is they will populate the group. They will use different operational leaders. And they'll use kind of different little structures that they can go out. Like, let's say, for instance, they've been approved to use a heavier gauge or a heavier rocket, or to use a UAV. So, for instance, that attack that happened out in Jordan, that was part of that larger base setup of Al-Tanf, which is in southern Syria, but it extends into Jordan. It's got its own kind of Syrian rebel groups that are there, so on and so forth. And the U.S. is helping them both in the anti-ISIS campaign, but also clearly and increasingly to kind of counter the Iranians who are moving around in that area. So you would get certain operational groups. Let's say, today we're going to use Kataib Hezbollah. They're going to launch, some UAVs at an American base, and then the Islamic resistance in Iraq is going to take credit for it. And then you'll also kind of notice a little shift in kind of messaging that will come out where maybe Kataib Hezbollah is a little bit more detailed in their statements about the attack. Like it sends these little hints at times. Nujabah is probably the least nuanced when it comes to it. They're quite open. And then other times you'll get kind of public statements that'll come from all three of those leaders. Abu Allah from Kataib Sayd al-Shuhada. You'll get one from Akram Kabi from Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujabah. And then you'll get some statement that will come out either from a spokesman or from some, a variety of different leaders within Kataib Hezbollah, about the right of the resistance to resist the American forces and push them out of Iraq and, something along those lines. So that's generally how they kind of work that. And we can also see this from the American. I mean, you said 8 responses. And I would say, how are we defining responses here?
Right.
Because I mean, I would argue that really we had maybe 2 true responses out of those 8. And actually, maybe it's, if we're counting the most recent one as 9, then I would say, 2 or 3. The reason I'm saying that is because most of these strikes were actually tactical in nature, and they were protective in nature. So we were not going out and just, knocking off another commander of Kataib Hezbollah or knocking off another main leader like Qasem Soleimani or Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. No, we were going after their tactical teams that were at that moment setting up and trying to launch rockets or launch UAVs. And in a number of those attacks, we had killed a number of Kataib Hezbollah people. I remember there was one that killed, I think, 5 of them in one shot. And then they hit a facility down in Juf al-Sakhr, which is, Kataib Hezbollah Central. They essentially run a private fiefdom down there. But I would say out of those responses, there was one that targeted an operational commander, and he was quite prominent within Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujabah. And that was at the end, I want to say it was in the end of November, early December.
Yeah.
It was December. Yeah. It's interesting, every day is flowing into the next.
It was before Christmas.
Yes, it was definitely before Christmas.
Okay.
And they got him around, he was in Baghdad area. So I'm thinking that was probably the most that I would count as, a quote unquote response, that you're actually going after a mid-level commander, and taking him off the battlefield. So it really hasn't, it's been far more tactical in nature, the way the United States has responded to a lot of this. And the responses, I mean, you'll hear the line out of DC, well, we want to de-escalate, we want to de-escalate, we want to de-escalate, we want to de-escalate. It's very interesting when the other party that's involved, which is Iran, has very slowly, kind of run this up a bit where they have continually escalated, whether it's in the Red Sea with Ansar Allah or the Houthis, or in Iraq using these organizations, or in Syria also using those organizations, or with Lebanese Hezbollah against the Israelis, and also different threats that are launched, against the United States by Lebanese Hezbollah. It's kind of an intriguing picture. It's almost like you're speaking past the issue. Hey, we want to de-escalate. And meanwhile, the bully keeps punching you in the face. It's like kind of like one of those.
Yeah.
What do you think about it now? What do you think about it now? Hey, look, I'm just trying to de-escalate. Maybe a wrong comparison given, we also have aircraft carriers and, long-range bombers, but, in a way it is kind of like that. It's like the guy sitting behind you constantly like flicking you in the back of the head, going, what do you do about it? Yeah, what are you going to do about it? And then when he gets hit in the face, it's like, we have to stop this aggression. It's
Right.
kind of the Iranian angle on this. But, I mean, what I would say is, it has not. It's very interesting how the administration, Biden administration, has been handling this, particularly with how the responses have been kind of meted out. And I would say the most recent one that occurred over the weekend, or I should say Friday. But I one could make the argument that it was the first kind of real response. The problem with the attack itself, though, was that the Iranians were warned for a week in advance. They were also told essentially what, they weren't necessarily told what the targeting packages would be, but they were told, hey, we're going to go after IRGC targets. Well, okay, you want everyone to go to ground and hide and not get nailed. Well, there you go. It's a great way to do it.
Well, before we dive into the airstrikes and the strategy behind it and the effectiveness or the lack thereof, there's been a lot of discussion since this attack on Tower 22 about the issue of control. To what degree does the Iranians exercise like operational control over these militias? And in my mind, the debate about it has just gotten very kind of silly and muddled down in the weeds to the point that it's sort of missing the most obvious answer. And I'm wondering if you could give us like a bit of clarity here, like their control over these groups or the lack thereof. What is the extent of that?
Well, here's the thing. I'm noticing, and you've already heard this from me, and I think you've seen when I've thrown stuff up on Twitter, I tend to be a little bit, sometimes I get pissed off enough where I'm just like, are you kidding?
Oh yeah.
This was one of those moments where I'd say, are you freaking kidding me? And, reaching out to people in press going, is this is this what I'm seeing published? There was an argument coming out. Now, there are truisms that are there, but again, it's been so decontextualized that, for the average person reading this, I mean, geez, I just scrolled through how many different, different Arabic language militia, militias with complicated names that, another group is named the same thing, and it's in a region that we've been in now fighting for how many decades. It's a confusing process, and what I notice is that's a lot of political playing that was going on regarding, who's really in control. So let's get something straight right off the bat. The Iranians, there really has been no argument that the Iranians don't always maintain 100% control on a proxy. It's, and I want to get this straight though. There's a proxy and then there's a proxy. There are groups that the Iranians control that are believers in their ideological system, like true believers. They believe in what's called absolute wilayat al-faqih, which technically means that group, if Khamenei himself gives an order because he is the supreme leader, then guess what? That's what goes. Because he is the mouthpiece for Imam al-Mahdi before Imam al-Mahdi returns to earth. That is the theocratic ideological view that they follow. And, whether that's extended through the mouth of an IRGC commander or what, or through a representative that's associated with Khamenei, who's issuing, specific fatwas and different edicts, taklif shari's, stuff like that, then that's how it goes. Now, those groups, I mean, a good example of one of them is Lebanese Hezbollah. But that doesn't mean that Lebanese Hezbollah does not have its own, autonomous interests. It doesn't mean that it doesn't push back at times if need be, but how much pushback does that really, how much of that really matters with specific organizations like this? But, at the end of the day, there's also other issues too. And I don't want people to think, well, wow, that sounds like a pretty good level of control. I guess it's all like that. Not necessarily. I could also make the argument, the Iranians have had issues with some of their, I'll call them better Iraqi groups at times.
That would be like KH, who's probably one of their better ones.
Well, Kataib Hezbollah, like I mentioned before, that's KH.
Yeah.
Kataib Hezbollah has been extraordinarily loyal. In fact, they were loyalists pulled out of loyalists, and they were given, a lot of very fancy weaponry very early on. Their commanders were like true believers. They were started by probably one of the biggest Iraqi true believers, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Like you couldn't get sharper than that. And by the way, they were also true believers ideologically speaking. So you have that context there too. But there are other groups that also, when KH was created, like Asayib Ahl al-Haq, which I mentioned before, Asayib Ahl al-Haq, they were peeled away from Muqtada Sadr's ranks, both to put pressure on Sadr, but to also kind of maybe be another angle that the Iranians could penetrate in the Iraqi Shia sphere. Now, AAH, which is Asayib Ahl al-Haq, it's run by Qais al-Khazali. They haven't been without their issues with the Iranians because, again, they're coming out of the Sadrist stream. It's not always the most pro-Iranian. They've had other little issues before, but they've also, it doesn't mean that their disloyalty at times has meant that they're a terrible proxy. Look, they've supplied guys for Syria. They have supplied plenty of fighters to manage affairs in Iraq for the Iranians for all intents and purposes. They have aided in other overseas adventures, including in Bahrain. So they've done stuff like that before. But sometimes it comes down to, hey, it's maybe better to play this Iraqi nationalist angle and let's distance ourselves from the Iranians, or maybe the Iranians are telling us to do stuff that maybe we don't want to do. Maybe we're trying to grow a little bit more autonomy on this side. So occasionally that does happen. And I do have to mention with AAH, I mentioned the front strategy before. AAH was involved in that. There were a number of reports that came out that AAH actually disobeyed the Iranians. They were using these attacks to demonstrate kind of their own bona fides domestically, that they could be tough guys in the room and do as they pleased. And they could hit American sites, and if maybe there was a prohibition on rocketing the embassy today, maybe they would do it occasionally to show that they had some level of independence and autonomy. Now, how that grew out, I mean, again, it's clear that these AAH groups grew, they kind of coincided with the other major effort that was going on, that was involving, a variety of other Iranian proxies. But, when that split came and how deep it was, I'm not saying that, they're no longer Iranian proxies anymore. They are. They're still in that
Right.
network. They're still deconflicting with the IRGC, with the Iranians, and with other groups. And the Iranians aren't stupid on this either. So, it's kind of like saying, well, we have all these groups, so what do we do? It's interesting how a lot of people, and I've written extensively about this, how the wide kind of pantheon of these different groups, there's actually a benefit to it. The more splinters I create, the more tension I create within those ranks. It oddly kind of it operationalizes them in a way where it makes them a bit more utilitarian. How much support am I getting from the Iranians if I give 1,000 extra guys to the front in Syria? Well, they're going to give me more money. They're going to give me more influence. They might give me a new television network and some media support on that. They might give me some more cash privately. Those thoughts come into it. And don't think the Iranians aren't looking at this like, hey, we could, pit Peter against Paul and, see what kind of happens. And one of my, I wouldn't call it an assumption because I've done enough interviews now where it kind of sounds, pun intended, kosher enough. But there was one where, Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, which was split from AAH's ranks. Very interesting that it was split from those ranks using a rather popular former Secretary General of that group. May there have been personal disagreements between Qais al-Khazali and Akram Kabi? Sure. But the Iranians are looking at this like, hey, we don't want to throw away, the baby with the bathwater, number one. Number two, this might be very good to put some pressure on AAH when they, maybe they want to be a little too autonomous, and we don't necessarily want that. And here's a good way to do it. Here's a good way to overshadow Qais al-Khazali within a Soderist network that we want to control. So there's these little pieces that are in there, okay, well, we're now using this new splinter of a splinter of a splinter of a splinter to have this add-on effect. I mean, it does sound complicated, but at the end of the day, when you're kind of running this like a business and it's kind of cellular replication of groups, you want sometimes those cells to play against one another if one might become cancerous. You need to do stuff like that. How do you keep them in line? How do you actually keep the machinery working and kind of lubed up so that it's always moving? And I think in large part, a lot of people tend to ignore that. They just look at this large pantheon of organizations. They go, well, there's no way they can control that, without actually saying maybe the Iranians have calculated that they can't control everything, but this is a much better way to do it, where they're kind of 2 or 3 levels removed. And and still the moving pieces are moving. So I think that also plays into a lot of this.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more. There was some reporting between the Tower 22 attack and this first round of airstrikes on Friday. A CNN article in particular comes to mind that was sourced apparently from inside the U.S. intelligence community, claiming that the Iranians, the IRGC, the Quds Force, have gotten a bit nervous or concerned with some of the strategies and tactics these militias have been using against U.S. forces in the region. How do you feel about that? Have you seen any kind of truth to that? No? Okay.
No, I don't see any truth to that. In fact, that sounds, I mean, I can say it pretty straight out here. That sounds like a pile of BS.
Okay.
A pile of BS from policymakers and specific kind of, I would say, politico people within the intelligence realm that have their own kind of policy that they wish to push. And also, it does not actually fit with what these Iranian-backed groups have been doing. In fact, they've been so open and I mean, demonstrably so. I mean, let's just look at the weapons, for instance. We're talking about a variety of these groups that are all part of that Islamic resistance in Iraq. Were quite open with their press announcements to say, we are entering into a second phase. And then they would change the weapon systems out and say, oh, we're using something more advanced now. Interesting. I didn't see the Iranians complain about that when they delivered those weapon systems to them.
Yeah.
And then also signed off on saying you can use those now. Because if we remember back to what happened with AAH, when they were using certain weapon systems that they were not approved for, guess what ended up happening? The Iranians said, guess what? You're not doing this anymore. Sorry, guys. Sorry, Charlie. The supply is no longer there.
So they can shut it down when they want to, and they will.
Yes. Okay. And there's a reason why they've picked very specific groups to operate through that are loyalists, because they will listen. This is not because, well, they're Iraqis and they're just crazy and they're just going to do their own thing. There have been instances of Iraqis, like in Syria, being a little bit high-handed, a little nutty on the battlefield. But you're dealing with three of some of the most loyal groups that they have created. And yes, they may have their own notions on how violent they wish to be, but the Iranians, after learning the hard way, have really formed a setup that, it's the loyalists, carrying out these attacks. There's no denying that. I say there's no denying that because the administration itself has said that, okay? The targeting that we have done against Iraqi Shia militia forces, if you look at the two groups that were targeted, it was Nujaba and it was Kataib Hezbollah, which has been, and Kataib Hezbollah has it's been very, very well known since the beginning, since they were truly started from the 2005 to 2007 chunk of time during the Iraq War. It was so well known that they were hardcore Iranian loyalists that, even Iraqis would call them in leaked cables the Khamenei groups because they directly reported to Khamenei. There is no denying that there. That's essentially crafting an argument that doesn't actually exist. That's looking for nuance where there is none and then complaining about this lack of nuance you've found. You know what I'm getting at? This is like something that academics do. Well, there should be more nuance here, but I'm going to write my thesis on why there's no nuance and there needs to be. Like it throws your brain into, a complete atrophy. And that's part of frankly, I would say that's part of the estimation here, because that is not how these groups are working at all. It doesn't mean to say, I feel terrible having to kind of caveat this every single time. It doesn't mean that the Iranians just use groups that are 100% loyal to them all the time, but you can see the process and how it's going on in Iraq and what they've been using. And it clearly demonstrates that they have very deliberately picked those organizations to operate through because of their loyalty, because they can trust them with these different arms, because they can trust them with promoting the message. They wouldn't have done it otherwise. And by the way, the attacks that they have been launching, it is, I have talked to enough people in Department of Defense. I've interviewed enough people. I've interviewed enough people even within Shia militia sections. They're targeting, it's like by the seat of our pants, we're kind of escaping casualties in many cases here.
Yeah.
And the weapon systems that they're using are aiming to do exactly that. And what I find, again, this is another add-on to the fascination here. It's interesting. Every single time they're successful with one of the attacks and they've killed somebody, then what do? They back up and say, you know what? I think it's time for a ceasefire. It's like Hamas pulling this. They had catastrophic success in the attack. And then once the airstrikes and just complete destruction is being rained upon Gaza by the Israelis, the response to that is, I think it's a really good time for a ceasefire now. Well, we got away with what we needed to do, but it's perfect time for a ceasefire now. It is that blatant. It is that plain. It's really fascinating to kind of see this. It's the same modeling that's going on with this because they are reading, I feel bad saying this. I'm being quite blatant in what I'm seeing here, and it almost sounds partisan, and I don't want it to. But it is. They're viewing the administration as being in a weak position and not able to really respond. And whenever they see that, whenever you kind of give them a little rope, they're going to take even more. And they keep testing. They're going to keep flicking you in the back of the head until they're slapping you in the back of the head, until they're spitting at you in the back of the head. It's like you're sitting in a classroom. I was bringing that up earlier.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of notion. And so I think in this case, it's just interesting how that's all playing out. And also, if I were an Iranian negotiator playing that game of implausible, plausible deniability, it's we only have so much control, but you still have to go through us to make sure it stops. Wait, what?
Yeah, that doesn't
Which
make
is
much
it?
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, which is it? And I think it's this wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more kind of policy. And I think for a lot of policy makers, they know what the deal is, but it's the other question of you have to take it from have some empathy from their position too. It's well, we don't need to get involved in yet another war, even though we are being dragged into another war. It's I can kind of see that notion there. And I can also see kind of the understanding of, well, if we got to deal with this, if we're going to kind of back channel them, and if we're going to kind of, de-escalate this whole thing and da 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 da. I can see why they would throw something out like that, especially with all the criticism that's, well, hey, it's been 6 or 7 days since, this attack happened. You guys have been, quote unquote, telegraphing, everything to the Iranians, and what you want to do. It's interesting because, it's a strategy that frankly has been around since earlier than 2010. Oh, we just don't know the nature of the groups and we have no idea what's going on here. And I would say, we have far better institutional memory than than we did in say 2010
Yeah.
about some of these groups, to the point where it's like ludicrous coming out, and thus infuriating for me. There's been enough written here where normally I complain about how little is written about Shia militias and about Iran's proxy networks, but there is so much written, and these guys, I know that they've read it. Like, give me a break.
Yeah.
It does not pass the sniff test at all.
Yeah.
So it really grinds my gears. Sorry.
That's all right. So that's probably a good segue into the administration's response to Tower 22 so far. So let me give you some details on that. On Friday, February 2nd, the U.S. Air Force, utilizing B-1 long-range bombers and fighter aircraft, carried out strikes against 85 targets across 7 facilities in Iraq and Syria. The targeted facilities, as reported by U.S. Central Command, included command and control operations centers, intelligence centers, rockets, missiles, and drone storage depots, as well as logistics and munition supply chain facilities belonging to militia groups. Somewhere in the range of 46 militia figures are believed to have been killed in the strikes. The Pentagon has indicated that further rounds of strikes could follow in the days and weeks ahead. So, Philip, what's your take on this response to Tower 22?
I don't think it was the correct style of response, and for a few different reasons. Again, very interesting show of force, but the show of force did not really show itself, to be perfectly frank. I've noticed this quite a bit. This has been kind of the Twitter X, one of the responses on there, which I happen to agree with, because it is true. Look at the Israelis when they're responding to Hezbollah issues in the north, and they're dealing with IRGC in the north of their country. They're very tight-lipped about who they're going to kill and when. And then what have they done? They've killed a number of senior IRGC commanders that have very prominent roles, helping Lebanese Hezbollah and coordinating efforts with Hamas and kind of doing a bunch of other things. There have been a lot of them that have been shipped back in body bags to Iran, to the point where the Iranians have been going, oh, holy crap, there is an issue here. They are knocking these guys off. And, we got to go to ground. I remember they even, like, this is nonsense. There's no IRGC leaving Syria. But they're saying, God, we're going to have to, evacuate some guys here. And I remember that was kind of hitting certain deliberately English language press organ. It's not really true, but it's interesting how much smoke they've kind of kicked up because of that, because that's an actual hit that they're worried about. Those are irreplaceable, mid-level, senior-level commanders. Those are people with their fingers on the buttons. Those are people who have, network connections, and it's very hard to replace them. And so, you look at that in terms of a response that Lebanese Hezbollah is launching against the Israelis, or kind of a preventative measure by the Israelis, that has actually received a response from the Iranians. Now, you haven't seen a real militant response in that context, from all these commanders getting knocked off. But it's fascinating to me because you remember back to Soleimani and Mohandes. there was effect that occurred because of that. It degraded operational capabilities with them. It degraded networking. It degraded all of these things. And it's kind of fascinating. That was going on perfectly fine on one side, and that's not how we executed. Instead, what the United States did was, for over a week, we were saying, well, we're going to respond at a time and place of our choosing. Okay, that's fine. That's all well and good. I don't mind that. But then it extended out. We're going to hit the IRGC, and we'll do it wherever we want. And we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. And then everybody who's monitoring a screen where they can see where the planes are flying from, can see, oh, it's great. I can go on Twitter and know about the airstrike 4 hours before it's occurred in Iraq. I'm pretty sure that didn't send any signals to guys who literally follow this more closely because they've been bombed before. And then you look at the targets. Yes, we targeted Kataib Hezbollah was targeted. You had a number of other groups that were out there. So if you look at the sites, these are kind of sites that have been hit before. These are not new. I actually did the Shia militia mapping project back in the day for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Did it from 2019. It went from 2018 to 2021. That was the stuff that I was putting up on it. And so a few of the key areas, we hit a lot of targets in eastern Syria, a lot of targets in western Iraq. So on that Syria-Iraq border, that's really where we concentrated things, namely in an Iraqi town called Al-Qaim. And then across the line from Al-Qaim, you have Abu Kamal, which is the Syrian town that's there. And then to its south, you have Aqasha. It's like right on the border with Syria. So you have kind of the real loyal Iranian-controlled and Iranian-backed Shia militias in that area. So upwards of 10 of them. Kataib Hezbollah being a main coordinator and a main one. One of the sites that we actually hit belongs to a group called Liwa al-Tafuf.
Mm-hmm.
And the hilarious thing of this is, if you want to hear a good example for how the Shia militia guys actually thought the U.S. was going to respond because we totally knew who we should be targeting, the Liwa Tafuf people. So Liwa Tafuf, their commander is actually the commander of Western Anbar, which is where that section is. So if you're out there in Western Anbar, he is the big, Qasem al-Musle, that's his name. But if you're dealing with it, you're dealing with him. So we hit one of his facilities. Well, the reason they had so many casualties there was because his group was like, yeah, they're not going to hit us because we're not necessarily involved in this. Yeah, we play closely with KH, and we sometimes will be over the border in Syria, and we'll sometimes be doing X, Y, and Z. But they're not going to hit us because they already know the deal. That was some of the chatter that was coming out of that. So it's interesting to kind of look at that. But who did we hit? We were not targeting. I remember because we actually hit that Liwa Tafuf site, people thought that Musla was killed, which, it was quite clear that he wasn't, but we didn't kill any senior, junior commanders, none of them. We were hitting smaller positions. I remember the Hashd al-Shaabi, the overarching kind of Iraqi government sponsored umbrella group for a lot of these Shia militias that the Iranians control. They had come out and they said, yeah, well, they hit an anti-tank missile battalion site. Oh, okay. I did not realize that had some, target. I didn't realize that was required to target. They hit people from, so it's the 45th Brigade. That's the Kataib Hezbollah section. And they hit a bunch of other little sections that were out there. And then in Syria, they hit some Syrian Hezbollah because there's been a number of, they call them Syrian Hezbollah, but the number of different smaller groups that are controlled by Lebanese Hezbollah and the Iranians, and they're located in eastern Syria near Deir al-Zur and Abu Kamal. So you had kind of issues out there, where we hit those guys, but these are all very low-ranking people. These are people that, we lost. Again, I don't want this to sound partisan, but I think the comparison is needed. There was a line that Donald Trump delivered where he said, if you kill an American, one drop of American blood, and we're going to take a gallon from you, from the Iranians, quite a flourish in terms of rhetoric. And he did actually do that. We lost a contractor in December of 2019. Then the Iranian-backed Shia militias started to try and raid the U.S. embassy that was there. And so our response to that was to kill Qasem Soleimani and Mohandes, and also, 10 other junior and senior level aides to them
Yeah.
in that airstrike. So, I mean, you look at that and then you juxtapose it to this. Yeah, we hit with a very heavy hammer, but then what did we hit? Hooray, we've destroyed yet another empty, another another empty gas station and another weapons storage facility. Oh, you got some cool images of some rockets firing off. And, what's the deal? And I mean, to say, well, and we got 50 for 3. Well, those are 50 people that they will pretty much repopulate very, very quickly into the ranks of those organizations. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of not. I mean, you look at the balance and you look at kind of, well, what are the other tertiary effects? What are the secondary, tertiary effects of it? Is this really going to turn anything off? It doesn't really do that. It's just, it's not where we are.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but you believe that the kind of best and only way to deter more of these attacks is to kill a lot more senior people than we have to date.
Well, I don't necessarily look. I don't think everything needs to come down to, well, we need to just keep killing people.
Okay.
In fact, there's part of me that would say, I think policymakers sometimes look for responses that will also feed a domestic agenda. I mean, that's kind of the case a lot of times. And, we're dumping, JDAMs on the Houthis and all sorts of other crazy stuff. I look at it in terms of, well, what would have the most outsized effect? What would be, if you want a positive end effect? I mean, even when it comes to killing people, do you need a 500-pound bomb to do it? Or, maybe some other kind of method? Maybe something a little bit more covert. Maybe you don't necessarily need to go out and do that. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, how would I know if it was being investigated? But, it kind of would seem a better use of resources than just doing a humongous bombing run that's just hitting a bunch of dust huts.
Right.
It's just not, it just doesn't really seem all that special. Now, what I would say is, I mean, the way you counter this, again, if we're using other examples, and it's not me promoting one over the other, but it's just, let's look for outsized effect. When Soleimani and Mohandes were killed, that had a genuine effect on the network and modes of control, the nodes of control, excuse me, for a lot of these Iraqi Shia militias. It did. Now, you see how this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Well, how many do they really control? And how do you know that? I mean, that's where somebody could kind of come in and say, well, are you arguing against yourself? No, I'm not. I'm actually not. You'll notice that the Iranians were faced with an issue. So what did they do? They rallied around their core guys. You know what I'm getting at? It's like their core guys are there, and they've also found other deconfliction mechanisms to kind of deal with this. But it took them 3 years, 4 years to do that. I mean, that's like an open opportunity. And that causes a lot of other friction, a lot of other issues. But you look at something like that, well, a lot of these old hand guys, they're getting older, they're getting long in the tooth. A lot of these other commanders, these other figures, they're not making the same level of replacement for them. And we saw this in the Syrian war when a lot of senior, very experienced fighters that were mid-level commanders were killed, and kind of who Lebanese Hezbollah would have to really pull on and who the Iraqi Shia militias would have to pull on. It demonstrates something where, I think to have that kind of effect, you take out certain commanders, you take out certain leadership, but you also, that's also where the demonstration of power projection comes from. I think we're also running into this line, which is deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. Well, okay, well, that cat's already out of the bag. So let's forget about that for 2 seconds. It's now, okay, how do we project ourselves and kind of get something done so that we can reestablish that, one, our interests actually have a place in the Middle East, but 2, you can't just act with impunity. I think we unfortunately, there has to be some level of acceptance now, regardless of what we want, when it comes to, hey, the militias. I thought that their attacks on us would just stop if we bomb them. I've heard this commentary quite a bit, but that's not actually the thinking that's going on there. These guys, by necessity, have to keep hitting to demonstrate that the Iranians have some level of power and some level of projection against the United States.
Right.
We're going to keep doing it. But the issue is, well, what's the cost-benefit analysis here? What's the cost-benefit ratio? It's interesting how people have, flipped a lot of this, because it's well, do you remember when the Iranians launched these ballistic missiles at American sites after Soleimani? And they kept doing these drone attacks. Okay, compare that to what they were doing when the United States was in Iraq from 2010 to 2011. Well, I mean, again, they were these groups, even as front groups, were, and I mean this recently in contemporary times, they were doing IED attacks and stuff like that, but a lot of them were fake. A lot of them were like little IED attacks on logistical networks. Like it was not, it was not the same level. And I'm not saying we don't have the same force presence in the country, but it was not the same thing. And so what they've done is they dialed it way down because they could only do so much and they were scared. And then what they're doing is they're slowly turning that dial back up. Hey, we'll use a Shahed 129 drone this time.
Yeah.
We'll use the larger rocket this time. We'll threaten sites that are in Jordan and Israel tomorrow. And that's what we'll do here. And it's little by little by little. It's, it's like turning the heat up on that frog, so it boils in the water. And that's essentially how they've been promoting it privately and also quite publicly. And it's kind of the schemo for how they're doing it. But I think it's if you demonstrate that a lot of those little nodes that they have out there no longer have, they no longer can really be operationalized in an effective way because you've removed command elements, or maybe you've removed a specific arms cache, or something here or there. It requires a little bit more organization and I think concerted effort as opposed to just looking for a response. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. No, that's helpful, I think. Anything else you would like to discuss or cover, get off your chest that we haven't yet today? Floor is yours, sir.
God help us all. Well, I mean, I think what worries me quite a bit about a lot of this going on, we're trapping ourselves in an earlier picture. And when I say that, it's kind of, looking at what was leaked out into the media. Well, we have no idea how much control is over these groups. Privately, anybody in policy knows exactly that the Iranians control the groups that were launching these things on us. But the problem that happens is, and I've noticed this from the Iraq War on, because again, there's very little institutional memory. People will read back and they'll say, well, we had no idea. And it was so fractious and we didn't know. I'm shocked to hear this from, it's a sign that I'm getting a little long in my tooth too, from, younger analysts who sometimes will kind of come up and they'll ask me a question. Yeah, but you know how fractious it is. Like it's this rejoinder now. Yes, they are, but let's contextualize that. Let's not kind of play this game of, well, we never really knew. I mean, what me worry, I've noticed that will gain traction, that will gain steam. And then when you actually have to fight these enemies later on, you're already kind of disabused of thinking of it logically or with factual basis or, like clinically. Now it's turned into, but there was these articles published that they really didn't have all that much control. So who knows? It's just autonomous. Help us. And that really scares me down the line. That really scares me down the line for American policymaking.
Yeah. Wow. That's a good point.
And it's not a good sign. The other thing is looking at how we're dealing with Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis. That's another case example where I would say, oh, cool. So they launched a bunch of JDAMs and against the Houthis, who were essentially winning against the Saudis, who were, doing the same thing, but heavier and actually far more aggressively. I mean, in this kind of, it switches my thinking on a lot of this. Well, okay, who are these key nodes that are here, that are coordinating with the Iranians, who are launching these missiles, who are getting the shipments in? I'm not saying we weren't interdicting things or kind of doing things somewhat effectively to kind of counter those measures, but I would wish that we would get out of this kind of almost childish stomping on the ground and saying, and we bombed them, we showed them, and actually focused on it in a far more concerted effort to kind of say, no, these are the individuals who are pushing buttons here. Because again, I mean, I also look at it, cost benefit analysis, if you want to look at it that way. It's interesting how these a lot of the Iraqi Shia militias that the Iranians were using in the front groups would put up like cost benefit stuff. Like we destroyed, this much American equipment. This cost them this much. And look at how burdened the taxpayer is in America. Like they were thinking along those lines. But, I let's flip that on its head and use it for Americans. Well, okay, cool. We just used, like, how much does a JDAM cost? And how much does this cost? How much does deploying stuff from, naval vessel cost? I mean, there are better targets out there and there are better ways of sending signals. And, I think that we are caught in so many contradictory sections of thinking. It's the, well, we want to de-escalate, but look at what we did with our bomber. Okay, maybe we could have used that more effectively, and maybe we could have done this better. And it's just all this stuff is kind of swirling around. I'm sorry I'm not being as clear as I normally would want to be, but I mean, I feel conflicted in my head, hearing this kind of all hashed out, and then kind of going, yeah, but then what's the end conclusion? And I think we are not coming to proper end conclusions, and we're not using the proper methods to kind of deliver ourselves to a better kind of endpoint.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I think you're giving us a lot to think about here. I don't know. I don't have any good answers here. Yeah. Well, shit.
Glad to leave on that heavy note.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is definitely probably not, I can guarantee, not the last round of these strikes that we'll see. There will be more. Yeah. So I guess we're just going to have to keep an eye on it. No real hard and fast kind of answers or resolutions today. But, that's the region, I guess.
No, it's part of the territory. I just,
yeah.
I think there are so many different political concerns, both internationally and domestically, that are at play right now, that, if I'm looking at it just from, the Phillip position of, hi, I'm Phillip, I do Shia militias.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally could have a few answers for you, and even some answers that I would contradict, my own answers, that is. And I mean, imagine adding that on to all of those other concerns, and also a lot of other kind of wonky thinking, or, people who I would maybe argue don't have the correct thinking on this, because they're also included in this too. And I think we're seeing the end result of that kind of atrophied thinking. And I keep saying atrophied thinking. I think there's combinations of analysis paralysis, a lack of action, a lack of knowing what to do, a disinterest in general when it comes to the region. And there's just so much swirling. I mean, we now literally have, remember, the administration was denying this, but a regional war that has been based around what occurred with Gaza and Israel on October 7th. And so it's like one thing, it's layer upon layer upon layer. It's the Shrek model of, it's an onion.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave it here today. Twitter is probably the best place for people to find more about you and your work. Is that correct?
Yeah, they can reach out to me, and I'll do my best to be polite and somewhat nice if they're nice to me.
All right. We'll have links to all that stuff in the show notes. This is the third show that you've been on with us.
I'm a regular.
I think, you know how like SNL has like the 5 Timers Club, that if you host 5 times, you get like a special jacket or something? I think I'm going to have to talk to Chris about making one of those for when
I would wear that jacket.
Yeah.
I would wear that jacket. We just have to make sure it has like a Lashkar Fatemiyun logo on the front or something. Just to kind of.
Do you think they would hit us with like a cease and desist if we use their branding without permission?
Something tells me that I mean, I would doubt that. I mean, then again, there have been other groups that have caused other issues regarding their music that has been sampled before. But no, I think we can get away with that one. I mean, hey, that's directly controlled IRGC Pakistani Shia unit. I think that they're going to be cool with it. I mean, the marketing, could you imagine that? I'm going to be totally self-deprecating here. I mean, with a guy like me wearing that around the DC metro area, they would wish for that kind of marketing.
Oh man, yeah, you would get off at like Roslyn or like the Pentagon and stuff, and like it would just be pandemonium down there.
Sup, bro? Yeah, and I know you love it.
All the SAIC contractors like just not knowing how to handle it.
I don't wear a CAC because it covers up the logo.
Thank you once more for all of your awesome analysis here. No better person I could think of to ask to come on when stuff like this goes down. And I know you've been a bit under the weather, so thank you for coming on and pushing through it today.
Oh, no worries. I just hope that as you were hearing my voice progressively change and drop in octave, that, look, I was doing this for the team, so I totally deserve a jacket now.
Thanks, man. All right. Well, thank you. Until next time, dude. Thanks so much for coming on.
I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.